and we partner with different cultural institutions throughout the city. A lot of our most recent events have been with the C Film Center and Denver Film, and we're really incredibly grateful to have them co-sponsoring this event tonight. They've really bent over backwards to make this happen. The film we'll be talking about, Adam Egoyan's Guest of Honor, came out, I believe, this summer. It was on their platform this summer, and by special request, we asked them to bring it back for this kind of special screening, 1 week only, so that we could have this conversation about this film and Egoyan's work in general. So we're really grateful for them, and really their partnership with us is really important to us. The C Film Center is one of those places in the city without which Denver would be a difficult place to survive. It's a really important cultural gem in the cultural landscape. So I want to thank Keith Garcia and Whitney for helping us out tonight on this. I also want to make a quick plug in case you're not familiar. The C Film Center does have a virtual cinema, which is really, really nice. Every Friday, they have new films showing on that platform, and you can find it by going to denverfilm.org. So I encourage everybody, if you enjoyed this film, you've probably already been on the platform, but if not, check it out at denverfilm.org. There's a link there, it takes you to their virtual platform. And then another quick word about D-Phi. So we're a public humanities center. If you like this kind of conversation, if you enjoyed the program tonight, please check us out at dphi.org. Again, that's dphi.org. We also have a podcast that we launched over the summer. We took a little hiatus, and now we're going to come back with a few more episodes called The Human Context. And you can find that on any of the apps that you use to listen to podcasts. So check us out, The Human Context. All right, enough plugs. Tonight, we'll be talking about Adam Egoyan, who's a really fascinating director who's been on the scene for over 35 years now. I'm sure many of you have seen some of his films prior to this one. I think probably The Sweet Hereafter, EXOTICA, maybe Chloe. Those might be his most popular films, not necessarily his best, although I do think Sweet Hereafter is probably his best film. Personally, I think the panelists, we might have a disagreement about that. We'll find out. So what we're going to do tonight is each of the two panelists and myself are going to give a kind of short 5-7 minute presentation, after which we're going to have a Q&A with the live audience. So if you're on YouTube now watching this, there should be a chat function on the right-hand side, and we encourage you to please go ahead and submit your questions, your comments. Keith Garcia is going to jump in at the second half of this program to help moderate those questions. So at any point during the conversation, beginning now, you can go ahead and post a comment or a question for any one of the panelists. All right, so let me introduce our first speaker. Maybe I'll introduce both of our speakers right up top, because otherwise it'd be awkward when I transition to my talk, because I won't be introducing myself. I already have. Okay, so Jim Aubrey has been professor at the Air Force Academy and here at MSU Denver for over 30 years, where he's been teaching mostly British literature, but also in recent years, courses in world literature and international film, particularly the films of India, where he's taken students for study abroad several times. He has published 4 books, the most recent one, a collection called Vampire Films Around the World, which contains essays on 16 cultures and their cinematic undead. So that he'll be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Craig Svonkin. He's executive director of the Pacific Ancient and Modern Language Association and professor of English at MSU Denver. Craig's essays include works on Disneyland, the Museum of Jurassic Technology, George Lucas, Harry Potter, the American poets Robert Lowell, Frank Bedard, Sylvia Plath, Juan Delgado, children's poetry, comic books, and picture books, and family structures as seen through and in literature and film. So thank you guys very much. You're our guests of honor tonight, and we really appreciate you joining us. Go ahead, Jim, let me pass the microphone over to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I admire the sneaky way Egoyan structures all 3 of the films of his that I've seen, so that you can't be sure at first who the movie's going to be about. It's usually a damaged male, And usually you find out only gradually what's going on in his mind. In EXOTICA, the protagonist turns out to be the regular customer at a strip club who has lost his wife. In The Sweet Hereafter, we meet several parents who have lost their children in a bus accident, but the important character turns out to be their lawyer, who has lost his wife. Guest of honor, tonight's film is about two damaged people, a troubled young woman and her father, who has lost his wife. The narrative creates a sense of mystery as it jumps back and forth among various time periods, so that as you piece together what has happened and in what sequence, you have to keep revising what you think of both characters. I liked it. In one of the early time periods, Veronica, now a 10-year-old girl, discovers that her father is having an affair with her music teacher upstairs while she practices downstairs. She even sees them holding hands during her recital. Her feeling that her dying mother is being replaced prompts Veronica to let her teacher burn to death when she falls asleep smoking. Years later, Veronica, in a serious relationship with her teacher's son, tells him about his mother and her father, which prompts him to commit suicide, accusing her of deliberately having become close to him so she could tell him about their parents. Years after that, while chaperoning a high school band tour, Veronica becomes involved in faking sex with two students in order to humiliate the driver of the school bus, who, although married, has been coming on to her. Veronica chooses to go to jail rather than exonerate herself. She says she deserves to be punished for what she has done, even though we know she hasn't committed the crime she's accused of. From jail, she tells her father that he is responsible for all that she has become, both for good and for bad. But isn't getting locked up a bit extreme? Is bad parenting a valid excuse for bad behavior? And isn't blaming her father somewhat at odds with punishing herself? Years later, after her father has died and Veronica is making funeral arrangements, she learns from the priest, who knew her music teacher well, that she and Veronica's mother had agreed to let her father have the extramarital affair as the mother was slowly dying from cancer. Veronica, as a child, didn't understand what she was seeing and blaming her father for. I start to wonder, even if these various events were based on misunderstandings, if Veronica sincerely believed herself responsible for them, then maybe her attempt to atone via self-imposed punishment may have some therapeutic value. She appears to be a successful conductor at the end of the film, so maybe she's supposed to be a better person too. Or maybe her father, Jim, does bear some responsibility, for he is morally compromised. He likes to invoke rules when they serve his purpose, even when it comes to naming Veronica's pet rabbit. However, like his daughter, he seems ready to retaliate against someone who breaks the rules. At first, he assumes that Clive, one of the students, somehow framed Veronica to protect himself. So Jim goes to the restaurant where Clive works and frames him by depositing fake rat pellets in the men's room. When Clive explains that Veronica didn't want him to testify that the bus driver's text was fake, that she wanted to be convicted, Jim then decides to go after the bus driver. His downfall occurs when he gets drunk as the guest of honor at a celebration and vows publicly that he's going to track down the bus driver and kill him. Sober the next day, he avoids arrest, but the episode reveals the violent urges beneath his moralistic facade. There are rules, he likes to say, but he doesn't follow them. I like to imagine a backstory for Jim, based on hints we are given. Veronica tells the priest that her father's decision to become a health inspector seemed odd at the time, after he had previously been a restaurant owner. We learned that he had emigrated from England, opened one restaurant, and aspired to open a second featuring Brazilian cuisine, but something caused him to leave the business. He later tells Clive's grandfather that it's not easy being from somewhere else. Perhaps Jim left his first restaurant believing that he'd been treated unfairly. Perhaps it had been shut down and his reputation sullied. Perhaps he might have thought because he was an immigrant. So he might later privately have enjoyed a sense of satisfied vengeance as a food inspector whenever he would shut down a restaurant. Our last image of him is wielding a meat thermometer as if it were a weapon. Our first image of him is eating Persian fast food off duty, then chastising the employee for not wearing a hairnet. This seemingly earnest rule consciousness becomes a pattern, but so does his focus on ethnic food establishments. I doubt that it's an accident that all 5 of the restaurants we see Jim visit appear to be owned by immigrants. The first is Chinese, the second Indian, the third is Spanish, the fourth is Austrian, and the fifth, where he becomes the guest of honor, appears to be Middle Eastern. The owner speaks in what I believe is subtitled Arabic, which invites us to see her as an ethnic outsider. Egoyan, being an immigrant to Canada himself, having been born in Egypt to Armenian parents, and then having grown up in Lebanon, he must have personal experience with ethnic outsiderness. And I think that's a subtext of this film. Takes from there. Craig?
Hi, Craig Svonkin here. And I'd like to thank Adam for putting this together, and Keith and Whitney for doing this. And it's also an honor to be on the same panel as Jim Aubrey, who started the film studies program at Metro State, really, in the English department, and has done such a wonderful job of growing it. So if you're interested in studying film, Metro State is a good place to go. Okay, so let me talk about some of the themes I see in this film, having also watched Adam Egoyan's like 4 or 5 other films, 4 or 5 of his other 13 or 14 films, that you see even from the first film, Next of Kin. And I'll just go through each theme or trope very quickly. So first is, I see in Egoyan's films an interest in family, but family not just as given, but also sometimes as chosen. Egoyan seems very interested in the question of the Anglo family as opposed to the diasporic family. But we could also think of that diasporic family as just sort of a class interest in family. You could see that in The Sweet Hereafter, where there's really questions of class and different family distinctions. In this way, it seems that Egoyan's very aware of the fluidity of the family and how family is desired, unsatisfactory, formed, and reformed, as family is more than merely given. Richard Flynn, in an essay that I quote from him in an essay that I co-wrote called The Meta Family, co-wrote with Steve Axelrod, Richard Flynn wrote that families are works of art, just as poems are. And I think we can see this in this film. It's the main character in the film, Jim, says, it's not easy being from somewhere else. And he's married a Brazilian woman, and he also talks about himself as being from somewhere else himself, being British, right, in Canada. Jim's speech often talks about he often creates a kind of binary, and this comes up in other films by Egoyan, of standards, moral standards versus family and love. He makes this clear, Jim, in the speech he gives at I assume it's an Armenian restaurant, because the actress who's playing the owner of the restaurant is Egoyan's wife, who's an actress in many of his films and is Armenian as well as he is. So in the speech he says, there's a greater health issue here at work, namely the health of this family, talking about the restaurant as a family. So that's one issue I'm really interested in Egoyan's films. In his very first film, Next of Kin, I would recommend it. It's available on Criterion Collection and I don't know, other places. For a freshman film, a very interesting film, where the main character leaves his own troubled Anglo family and then passes himself off as the lost child adopted by given away for adoption by an Armenian family. So it plays out in a lot of his films. We can see it in The Sweet Hereafter, of course, as well. The second theme I would like to talk about is the individual too, as a fluid thing, as performative, as fluid. And in Next of Kin, talking about that film as well, we can see Egoyan's first film being about this sort of fluidity. The main character in that film is named Peter, but then he passes himself off as Pebros, the lost child of this Armenian family, and then finds that he likes that family better, and then basically leaves his own family for that family. He's a very strange young man who enjoys watching himself on camera, on video. And that whole thing of how we see ourselves through the prism of the other or of the video plays out in a lot of Egoyan's films as well. Peter at one point says that being alone was easier if you became two people. One part of you would always be the same, like an audience, and the other would take on different roles, kind of like an actor. And this kind of idea of this sort of performative identity even plays out, I think, in Guest of Honor. So in Guest of Honor, we see Veronica playing different roles depending on her situation. She's the teacher, she's the aggrieved woman, she's the penitent. And Jim, who seems so fixed as a character, he too is played marvelously. I'm blanking out on the actor's name. How embarrassing! Anybody else want to give me a mnemonic help here? What is the actor's name who plays Jim? Well, we'll look it up later.
Thewlis,
Thank you, David Thewlis. Thank you, David Thewlis. This is what I do with my students when I have these senior moments. I have to ask for help. So David Thewlis, who's playing Jim, seems so fixed, but he wasn't always just father and husband. He was also and food safety inspector. He was once a restaurant owner. He was once a lover, right? And you can see that kind of fluid identity at work in his reaction to the restaurant, that Armenian restaurant, where he breaks his rules as food safety inspector. I would argue because the woman who's the owner of it, played by Egoyan's wife, reminds him of his own dead wife. So at times, I read it slightly differently than my colleague Jim, that at times the character is really trying to be what the career is, right? As food safety inspector and follow those roles, or be a husband and follow those roles. But that Egoyan is showing how difficult that is and how we have contradictory desires sometimes, or contradictory roles, like being a human being, being a mourner, that sometimes come in and complicate that. So this leads me to another theme, which is, I've got to get my themes in before I run out of time, which is capitalism versus human contact, like family, and how the two interact, and how capitalism or our profession can get in the way of our relationships and our interpersonal relationships. We can see this in all our lives. I mean, look, it's really hard not to let being a professor corrupt you. I'm giving away trade secrets here, but sometimes you start talking about your students and complaining about them, forgetting your old role as a student and how you complained about your professor. And I mean, this kind of theme goes all the way back to Chaucer, who shows how the roles we are in, the capitalist roles we are in, sometimes become ourselves, or can if we let it happen. So for example, we see the way that Jim, played by David Thewlis, if I only read on my notes, I would have gotten to his name, reads most interpersonal relationships through the prism of his job as a food inspector. He often talks about safety, issues of safety and rules, as my colleague Jim pointed out. But not entirely. For Egoyan, we also read through our histories. Jim reads or misreads his interaction with that Armenian restaurant owner, played by Arsene Kanjian, as through the memory of his own wife. And memory plays a role in this too. This thing can also be seen in the Sweet Hereafter, where Ian Holmes's lawyer character is really reenacting in a weird psychodrama, not just the death of his wife, but maybe even more importantly, the loss of his daughter to drugs, to drug addiction. So everything I think at first we read him as just a lawyer trying to make money in the Sweet Hereafter. But when we start to think about it, we realize, no, his quest is to somehow get vengeance for the loss of his daughter. A couple other themes I'll do more quickly, but we have the question of misrecognition or misreading of others. That comes up again and again in Egoyan's work. So Veronica misreads her own past. We realize that through the film's by the end of the film, we realize that what she thought was just a betrayal by her father was actually his attempting to cope through the mourning of his loss of his wife. But she doesn't realize that until after his death, tragically. And Veronica and Jim really don't understand or know each other entirely until this trauma happens to them. And really, I don't think Veronica understands her father very well until after his death. And this is sadly the case for so many of us, right? This is, I think, a deep, rich theme in Egoyan, that these communication problems, we have it in Guest of Honor, but we also have it in films like Next of Kin, or films like The Sweet Hereafter. I'll end with two others really quickly. Memory and how it impacts on us. I think I've already kind of shown that Jim is reading his current situation. He's misreading and reading correctly his current situation with that owner of the restaurant. He says to his daughter proudly, "They made me the guest of honor. They considered me the guest of honor." And of course, when we hear and we read the subtitles of her speech to her guests, we realize that she's just avoiding having her restaurant shut down. And she says, exactly what happened, that she thought on her feet and made up this party. They're all at this party to protect her restaurant from being shut down. And that she's told Jim that he's the guest of honor. Tragically, this moment where he's so proud of, and also strangely, ironically, the moment that he bends his rules is the moment that potentially leads to problems for him. He confesses in a drunken state that his desire to kill the bus driver who had harmed his daughter. But none of that would have happened if he hadn't misread the situation. And misreadings of things, I think, are common tropes in Egoyan. Adam, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm basically done. So capitalism and interpersonal relationships, I think I've got enough there for us to talk about. Memory and how it impacts on us in our lives. I was going to talk about video and how media and how we read things through media, like screens. We can see this in Guest of Honor with the whole misreading and reading of the messages on her iPhone. I think the more I've watched Egoyan, it makes me want to watch more. And so thank you all to those of you who included me. So I had this pleasure of watching so many Adam Egoyan films. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I really appreciate that. And I realized that I had the task of cutting you guys off, but no one was assigned the task of cutting me off. So give me a
you can go.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll wave.
Please do, especially if I go over. I really haven't. I'm going to kind of give my presentation more off the cuff as well. So one thing I will say just to begin is that Jim is a guest of honor in another place, perhaps in a less ironic sense. And that, of course, is the church at his own funeral, where he really is, in the final scenes of the film, a true kind of guest of honor. So I'm going to take a kind of bizarre, perhaps surprising approach to a guest of honor or guest of honor by way of, I'm going to try to move from the Sweet Hereafter to guest of honor by way of Søren Kierkegaard, the early 19th century Danish theologian cum philosopher who I'm sure most of you have heard of, and specifically his text Fear and Trembling, which is written in a pseudonym, as he mostly did write in pseudonyms, written supposedly by a man, Johannes D. Silencio, which is Latin for, John the Silent. I was watching an interview with David Thewlis about this film, and I'm not familiar with David Thewlis's work. I know he's quite well known and people love him from various things, including apparently the Harry Potter series, but apparently this is one of his least talkative characters. And he said it was quite interesting to develop a character in silence. And so that made me think a little bit about Johann D. Silencio and Fear and Trembling. And I think I'm going to try to explain why. So in Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, what Johannes D. Silencio does is he provides a kind of a retelling, several retellings actually, of the famous biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, which you're surely familiar with. He tells the story about how Abraham is called by God, and God tells Abraham that he's going to be the father of a great nation. The only problem, of course, is that Abraham is an old man and his wife Sarah is an old woman, and there's just no chance. It's inconceivable that they could conceive at that age. But lo and behold, they do, and God seems to, as it were, fulfill his promise. Abraham may, in fact, become the father of a great nation. Except once Isaac, Abraham's son, is born, he receives a second message from God. And this time God tells Abraham that he's supposed to pack up his donkey, load up his son Isaac and bring along his sharpest knife, because he's being asked to head up to the peak of Mount Moriah, which is, in Jerusalem. And when he gets to the top, he's to make a burnt offering of his son Isaac. In other words, he's going to have to sacrifice his son, kill his own son. So Abraham does this because he loves his son, but he is above all, as Kierkegaard says, a knight of faith. So he takes Isaac, they ride up Mount Moriah. The whole time Abraham is acting in absolute silence because he has to carry out a deed that is, strictly speaking, unspeakable, and gets to the top of the mountain. And it's quite interesting, at a certain point, once Isaac realizes what Abraham is up to and that he himself is kind of the sacrificial lamb, that Isaac will himself be sacrificed. Once Abraham realizes that Isaac has caught on, Abraham decides, for the sake of preserving Isaac's own faith in God, that he's going to put on a show. And he tells Isaac, I'm not going to sacrifice you because God wants me to. I'm going to kill you because I want to kill you, right? I'm going to do it because I desire to sacrifice you. And he thinks, Abraham thinks to himself, it's better that Isaac think that I'm a monster than to think that God is a monster. And of course, as his knife is about to plunge into the neck of his son Isaac, God stays his hand, and there's the third calling. He says no, and don't do it. And God provides a lamb as a substitute, and Isaac goes on to become the father of the part of this great nation, the Israelites. So, anyways, I tell the story in part because this story is retold in The Sweet Hereafter as well. Those of you who've seen it, and I realize that most of the audience probably hasn't. I'm not giving away any plot device. You should probably go and watch this film. It's an incredible film. But the main character, this film, The Sweet Hereafter, is like Guest of Honor in that it focuses on a father-daughter relationship. And in that film, as Craig has already mentioned, the daughter is a drug addict and the father has a real incredibly troubled relationship, perhaps more troubled than even in Guest of Honor. And he tells a story. The main character in The Sweet Hereafter tells a story about when his daughter was an infant. He and his wife were staying at a cabin, and the daughter was bit by a black widow spider, and her neck started to swell up. They called the doctor. The doctor said, okay, get to the hospital as quickly as you can. You have to make this journey to the hospital. I know it's a long journey, but pack up your bags, get your daughter in the car, but bring along your sharpest knife, because there's a chance that your daughter's throat is going to swell up before you reach the hospital, and you're going to have to take that knife and basically give her a tracheotomy. Is that what they call it? Am I pronouncing that?
Yes.
And so the father tells this story, and there's kind of continual flashbacks throughout the film of the father holding the infant in one hand with the knife in the other. And the thing that the father feels oddly guilty for is he feels this weird sense of guilt that he was prepared to do it. He was prepared to make the sacrifice. And of course, ironically, it's a sacrifice for the child, but he feels guilty nonetheless about that fact. And it really is a kind of pivotal moment in the scene. It's when he kind of confesses this story. So he's confessing to a guilt which perhaps he ought not to feel, right? In the same way that you might say Abraham keeps his silence and feels a kind of strange, odd guilt in Kierkegaard's reading because of the act that he's going to have to perform. And my sense is that in this movie, Guest of Honor, Jim bears the same kind of guilt. Jim bears the same kind of silence. There's an act, a deed, which is in some sense strictly unspeakable. It's something that he cannot communicate to his daughter, namely that his wife has given him permission to have a romantic affair with this other woman, knowing that she's going to one day die. How do you explain that to your 8-year-old daughter, that this woman that I'm having an affair with is in fact going to be a substitute mom? I'm doing it in some sense for your own sake, so that you have a maternal figure growing up. And there are other ways in which I think Jim's character makes these strange sacrifices for the wife. I would also kind of maybe offer an alternative interpretation, Jim, of the character Jim, David Thewlis's character's decision to go from working a restaurant to becoming a health inspector. Anybody who's worked in the restaurant business, especially anybody who's had to manage or own one, knows that it is a 24/7 job. It never ends. And there's a moment in the scene where Jim's character seems to suggest pretty clearly that the reason why, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it's a suggestion, the reason why he left that job was so that he could spend more time with his daughter. And this was right around the same time that his wife is dying, it seems. And it's weird because the daughter doesn't even understand it, doesn't understand the sacrifice that's being made. But because the daughter said, well, that's my father makes some really strange choices. I don't know why he left the restaurant business behind and became a health inspector. Like, I don't know. Well, interestingly or ironically, for your sake, for your own sake, he did it so that he could spend more time with you. But of course, you don't tell your children that you're allowing your career to take a hit. You're sacrificing something important for you for their sake, because that's going to produce, pretty strange kids who might have their own strange guilt complexes. So anyways, the thought that I just want to leave you with is this notion that at the core, at the kind of the heart of a number of Egoyan's films, there's a kind of a deed, some kind of act that's occurred in the past for which the dominant characters feel a sense of guilt. But ironically, in some of those cases, the guilt shouldn't, they feel guilty about the wrong sorts of things, right? There's a kind of interesting dynamic between guilt and innocence and what's speakable and what's not speakable, right? What's said and what's not said. So I'm just going to leave it there because there's so much to talk about. I'm sure we have like 27 minutes to kind of just, riff on these themes. Yeah, why don't we do this? Why don't Jim and Craig, if you guys want to chime in or respond to each other.
Can I say, I'd like to say something. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting about guilt, because Veronica herself reenacts guilt in strange ways, right? In her self-flagellation for the sin, her childhood sin of not saving her music teacher and feeling guilty at maybe causing her boyfriend, the music teacher's son, suicide. Sorry, if anybody's watching this and hasn't watched the movie yet, they're in big trouble. We should have said all spoilers all night long, but hopefully they've watched the film. If not, turn it on, turn us off. We'll watch the film, come back and turn us back on. Anyway, so yeah, I think you're right. And in the Sweet Hereafter, the lawyer character, Ian Holmes' character, is dealing with his feelings of guilt over his daughter by coming in and probably not helping anybody in this community, but he thinks he's helping people in this community. And this happens again, and I think you're right, this happens again and again in the film. At first I was thrown off by Veronica's behavior because I'm the opposite of her. Like I would not be willing to go to jail in order to atone for my sins. I think I atone for them every day in many small ways. But so maybe it's a very Christian theme, a very Catholic, well, I guess with Egoyan it would be probably Armenian orthodoxy, right? A theme, and I don't think of him as a religious director, but maybe he is more, because I see these themes. Maybe he's the Armenian version of a Scorsese in some way, if we want analogies.
There's a connection, Craig, to something you'd brought up, Jim as well, to some extent. The dialectic between the private and the personal, the dialectic between you describe the capitalist versus the human relation. But my sense is that the main characters in at least 3 films of his that I can think of, maybe 4 off the top of my head, The Adjuster, The Sweet Hereafter, and Guest of Honor, the main character tries to kind of undo in his professional life the mess that they've made in their personal life, right? So their professional life allows, for example, Jim's character to control things, and it's all about preventing contamination. There's a sense in which he describes the bad reputation that his daughter receives as a result of her conviction as being a kind of contamination. It's a cancer that grows. And so there's this way in which he's fighting contamination through his work. He's obviously very fastidious and incredibly anal and controlling, but his own life is in some sense in shambles or a bit of a mess, and there's a lot of untidiness there. Not his house, but his life and his personal relationships.
Yeah, It's interesting you brought up the sweet hereafter and the tracheotomy because, Jim could probably talk about this more. I think you might want to, Jim. But there's that unusual relationship over the rabbit. And I'm just going to say that between the rabbit as a love object, but also the rabbit as a possible contamination. Because Jim, in one of your emails, you mentioned the rabbit. So I want to hear from Jim more about the rabbit and as a thematic, and see if you're reading it differently.
Well, I had not thought of the rabbit as inadvertent contamination, but more as a deeper kind of contamination that everyone suffers from. And it prompts us to misbehave. It prompts us to, I anticipated some student asking the question, what's going on with the rabbit? And I tried to sort out my thoughts about this afternoon. And I think the rabbit has a kind of symbolic role in the picture. It's a docile creature, but it's also associated with an underground existence of some kind of dark forces and maybe contamination or human behavior, the unconscious. It's hard to imagine a more docile creature than a rabbit, I think. But and Jim takes excellent care of Benjamin Bunny, and it lives a long life until it dies on the very same day that Jim is confronted by the police for having proclaimed that he was planning to murder that bus driver. And in his unrestrained drunken state, Jim phrases his death threat, in kind of shocking language. He says, "I will find the beast and kill it." It, not him. I hear an echo of the chant in Lord of the Flies here, when the boys who are about to begin to kill each other in that novel, Golding novel from back in the 50s, they chant, "Kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood." This is the language of uncivilized unrestraint. And when Jim's animalistic impulse comes out, his revenge motive, he turns his enemy into the same kind of beast that he is inside and vows to attack it. A rabbit is an animal, and I would interpret its role here as representing the dark side of Jim's character that he usually manages to keep in check by behaving responsibly to protect his reputation, and more immediately so his daughter will admire him. His exemplary treatment of the rabbit is the first thing Veronica thinks of when the priest asks her what he would say at Jim's funeral. And then she drifts into what she calls her theory about rabbits, that their feet are considered lucky because they live underground and have access to the mysterious gods of the underworld. So in my interpretation, this underworld is a metaphor for the unconscious, our animalistic selves that have to be kept in a cage, restrained but not denied, and even respected. In the case of rabbits, via superstitious worship of their feet, like relics. So as far as rabbits being lucky, I don't think so. not in this film. But I don't know. Is that a stretch to see the rabbit as symbol of the unconscious or something?
No, I think that's exactly right on. I mean, that's at least this idea of a kind of a liminal creature that circulates back between the conscious realm and the unconscious realm. One thing that I listened to an interview with Adam Egoyan, and apparently he and his wife are lovers of rabbits. They have always had rabbits. That's their pet of choice. And I think it was Adam who said something that was quite interesting. He said that rabbits are kind of these queer animals in that they're both, is it pet or food? Is it friend or food? Pet or dinner? There are very few kind of domesticated, pet type animals that we also eat. You don't eat goldfish. You certainly don't eat dog. Or cat, but we do eat rabbit. And so there's this idea that the rabbit does kind of circulate between between kinds of domains, like you mentioned, Jim, between the kind of the world, life, the living, and the underworld, the dead, between the civilized and the uncivilized, order and disorder. And obviously, I think Jim's character in this film is kind of torn between these two domains. He's committed to order. He's committed to cleanliness, control, reputation. And at the same time, of course, what does he do? He violates all those norms, right? He contaminates the Austrian restaurant for the sake of blackmailing the owner and his son. He violates all of his own. So there's something kind of both, he's committed to these norms, and yet he's torn, and he finds himself in a position where he has to violate them. And the rabbit is, I don't know fully what to make of him, but I think your insight is exactly right. There's something kind of liminal about the rabbit as a creature and as a character in the film.
Can I add something to that? The rabbit also is a part of the rodent family, and as a safety inspector, his primary villain is the rodent, right? He's always looking for rats. The rabbit's our friendly version of the rat. The rabbit's also depicted as not a black rabbit, not a brown rabbit. It's a white rabbit, color of purity. And yet he's fastidiously picking up the rabbit's shit all the time, right? Trying to clean up memories or clean up the darker sides, as both you and Jim are saying. And finally, the rabbit must represent his love of his daughter, right? It is his daughter's rabbit his daughter doesn't have the rabbit. He's the one taking care of the rabbit, taking care of, still caring for the rabbit because I assume his daughter went to jail and he took over the rabbit's care, or maybe even before when she went to college or something. So it connects him to his daughter. And this plays out a primary theme in the film, which is his daughter says to the priest, played by the great Luke Wilson, says, my father I think my father did this, took me to the, didn't care about my music, took me to the piano teacher because he wanted to have an affair. This was, my playing the piano was just a cover. He didn't care about photographing me, which is a fundamental misreading of an either-or misreading of the father's behavior. Of course, he loved his daughter, he cared about her music, but he was also going through the mourning of watching his wife die. And of course, he's an adult man. So the rabbit represents all of those, the purity of the memories, the love of his daughter, but also, like the Sweet Hereafter, he's willing to have the rabbit's feet chopped off at the end in some kind of weird ritual.
Mm-hmm. Oh, by the way, that's interesting you say that, because again, another thing that Egoyan had mentioned in one of the interviews that I watched was that he's looking for that Jim's character is looking for some kind of ritual. He's kind of obsessed with ritual of sorts and some kind of sacrament. And you're right, this cutting, this kind of circumcising of the rabbit's feet at that critical moment, I think is something like a strange ritual. He needs the priest of the high temple to perform it, right?
Right.
But nonetheless, it's like
he also, when he's drinking the wine and giving his toast at the Armenian restaurant, he says the blood. So he doesn't seem like a religious man, but the sacrament maybe the rabbit has become part of his sacrament of coping sacrament. And then I think about how that kind of secular, that's why I compared him to Scorsese, that kind of secularization of religious practices plays out in a lot of his films. One of his stranger films, Calendar, all about a photographer and his wife or girlfriend, I guess, who go to Armenia to film churches for a calendar. They don't seem very religious at all, and yet the whole thing is played out as religious imagery, but for something as unimportant as a calendar. And this plays out, I think, in the Sweet Hereafter, even in Chloe, which is I think not the best of his films, but even in Chloe we see things that are in Exotica too, things that are sexual played out in things that are about coping played out through weird sexual practices. I don't want to give away Exotica, but the death. He
visits the nightclub every other night. It's a ritual for him. He said Jim needs ritual, and this treating of the rabbit as some sort of supernatural object of, respect is a kind of expression of religious impulse, I think, and use of and ritual often is a means of being religious.
Right, and especially for trauma. In Exotica, we have another case of a father who's lost his child. I mean, it seems like such a central trope. And there, I mean, what at first we just see as prurient and sexual, we find out eventually is part of his coping ritual to try to deal with the loss of his daughter. Sorry to give away another plot of another Egoyan film. You'll forget this.
Film. Let's head to audience questions. No,
Yes.
but seriously, I think we should invite Keith Garcia back in. Keith Garcia is well, he directs the C Film Center, and he's going to join us. I don't know if he'll be joining us by video or just by audio, but he's the one managing the Q&A chat box. So Keith, do we have any questions? Have we put our audience to sleep here?
We do. We have a nice discussion, and I'll be your guy in the sky with our comments. You won't see me, but you'll hear me. And we'll start with there's a lot of discussion about the rabbit. So I'll try to group all those together into one kind of like what everyone was thinking.
I think we've killed the rabbit. Okay, no, just kidding.
Kill the rabbit.
Let's not put it that way.
We did a rabbit test, and that's what happened. Let's go with this question here from Vanessa Jade. I think it is interesting that Jim uses capitalism and his interpersonal relationships, especially when he meets Clive and threatens their restaurant with his authority. So less a question and much more of just a statement of that relationship. Do you guys have anything to say on that?
Well, I'll say just this. The lines are blurred, at least, right? Like he thinks he can compartmentalize these, but they become blurred. Really, I think he's betraying the capitalist Jim for the familial Jim. And personally, I'm okay with that because I think I value, like, I shouldn't give away anything I've actually done, but if a student comes to me, let's say, and tells me that they're traumatized, something's gone wrong with them, I will bend the rules for them a little bit, and try to be as fair to the other students as possible. So I value the interpersonal over the please don't show this to my bosses.
None of your but then, Craig, don't worry.
That's right. So, but I think we all do that, probably. I mean, we're all empathetic in that way. I remember one of my professors once saying that he gave all through the Vietnam War, he's passed on now, but a great professor, he gave all these students passing grades who didn't really deserve passing grades to help them stay out of the war because they were in college. He said that they were not in college to do it. So sometimes our ethics of the work can come into conflict with our personal ethics, and I think that happens for Jim. Now, maybe he does something wrong in manipulating and scaring the German restaurant owner's livelihood in order to get closure for himself or information from himself. But we could talk about that. Whether what is the right thing and wrong thing to do when these kind of different realms of ethics come into conflict.
Mm-hmm. There's something about the fact that he has only 3 signs in his briefcase, right? There's the pass sign, the conditional pass sign, and then the closure sign. Everything seems so definitive and compartmentalized, and there's a kind of dread that you feel on behalf of the characters, these various characters who own these various ethnic restaurants, as he reaches into his briefcase, which sign is going to come out? There's some kind of
and we never see him use that middle sign, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. I can't be certain of it, but I think you're right. I think he never does.
So he's turned even a three level into a binary, which is even more problematic.
Yeah, that's true. There's this kind of I keep on wanting to go back to the kind of bricolage, Claude Lévi-Strauss notion of the kind of. But let's take another, Keith.
Yeah, we have. I'll have 2 because it looks like it's two folks talking about the same thing. Shun Mosley says, I felt a God complex in Jim, specifically for making those sacrifices and strange choices that seemed to suggest he was trying to protect his daughter, who was punishing herself. And Alexis V says, to go off of that, it was interesting to see how Veronica went to jail for this possession/authority of power, when in reality, Jim was the one truly using his authority of power.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. That Jim is the one who's abusing his power, whereas Veronica's not at all. She kind of
his threat to close down restaurants is based on, well, that's his power, and it exists because of capitalist organization of labor. But as Craig might point out, but that's his way of kind of acting on his contamination, and I hadn't thought about Veronica's playing any kind of power game.
Well,
it's self-directed, not she's not trying to defend health of the public or the status of a restaurant.
Well, to be a little bit nuanced, I mean, I don't think she deserves to go to jail for what she did or even be fired, but she did bring underage people into a simulated sexual act in order to get vengeance against this man who she thought was doing something inappropriate. I mean, she does bend the rules in a way that's similar to her father, right? When in order to try to mete out justice. Later on, she regrets it and punishes herself. And so does Jim too, I think, in some ways. Later on, he regrets his action and sort of maybe punishes himself a bit, although we don't see that. And in this way, that her comment to her father that you quoted, Jim, that like he says, why did you do this? Why would you do this? And she says something like, well, everything I am is because of you. And then she says, for good too. Everything problematic is because of you. And then also, everything good I am is because of you. So I like that nuance that she's learned in prison. Most people don't learn much in prison.
The one thing I would think, Craig, there is a question, I think, about when Veronica decides to use this kind of strange, convoluted social dynamic as a form of self-flagellation, as a way of bringing upon herself the punishment she thinks she deserves. Because I think one could argue, I'm not entirely sure how I read it, but one could argue that the moment when they're kind of, I don't know if you remember, they're up on a balcony, and it's up on this interesting, it's really nicely shot scene. They're on this balcony, and that's when the young boy shows the illicit text to Veronica that she supposedly sent, etc. And she first kind of balks, and she's like, oh, that's I didn't send it, whatever. But then she follows up. She says, okay, we're gonna do this, but we're gonna take it further. And it's not entirely clear if she's already decided that she's going to use this as a way of getting the punishment she needs, or if this is a way really to kind of getting back at the bus driver. I kind of feel like she doesn't care about the bus driver. My sense is that the bus driver means so little to her that he cannot be the ultimate motive for this elaborate, convoluted kind of charade that she plays with these students.
Do you think
there is one logical reason for her to feel offended by him, because she notices his wedding ring, and he notices her noticing his wedding ring. She feels that this is adultery that he's proposing, and it's the same thing she thinks her father has done. And so she does have a motive for wanting to punish him.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, she's reading through the history. Everybody in Egoyan reads through their memories and history, as we probably all do. And so she's reading into this, her anger at her father, I think. But I think I wouldn't reject yours either, Adam. She may be also starting to feel guilty about her own. I mean, she obviously feels some deep guilt about her boyfriend's suicide, and probably the death of her music teacher.
One other thing that I'll throw out there, and then we'll take another question, Keith, that Egoyan said that was, I thought, pretty illuminating. Maybe not for Veronica's character, but for Jim and for a number of other characters in his films. He said that he's always working out the tension between our tendency to want to create, kind of constitute an identity by connecting dots in our past, and then on the one hand, and then also our tendency towards avoiding responsibility. But if you think about it, of course, in order to constitute a self, in order to constitute identity, we have to connect dots both with our past and our futures, right? I mean, we connect to our futures by way of keeping the promises that we made, right? I make a promise, and if I keep it, I am the same person tomorrow as I was today. And then going back, in order to kind of be the same person, I have to own up to my past, and I have to take responsibility for it. But it seems that there's this desire to kind of flee from one's responsibility as well, and that has ramifications for the unity of oneself and for one's own self-conception. Anyway, I throw that out there only because Egoyan said it, and I think it does kind of help make sense of some of the characters, not all, in this film. But Keith, do you have another question for us, comment or question?
I do, and I'm going to link it to a little bit of a discussion that happened in the chat, so you can follow a thread there. But the question started from Fiona Griffith, and she said, how did Jim die? Veronica claims that he was sick, but he did not seem sick other than being a drunk at the end. And then this went down to more talk about his death, that odd that at the end, Jim checks the temperature of the meat and slowly fades away. Curious about his death from the beginning. Cassie Gibbs added, off of that comment, he seems to disappear at the end, but is still in the mirror in a different spot. And someone, Vanessa L, said, me too. Is he a vampire then, I guess? And that interesting to me that, and this is Vanessa Jade, he seemed to be the main character, hence guest of honor, but we never received closure for his death. So a big question mark around his death at the end there, and what the symbolism is of that.
It is curious. It's a mystery, and this was brought up in a discussion with the cast and Egoyan at the Toronto Film Festival, I think, where someone in the audience had suggested that perhaps he committed suicide, and David Thewlis said, no, that's definitely not the case. He didn't take his own life. And Egoyan agreed that he died of quote unquote natural causes, or obviously not natural causes. He's too young for that, but perhaps of a disease or something along that. Probably COVID-19, quite frankly.
I should add real fast.
You should not laugh at that, but that's horrible, right, but funny.
But someone else just added, Promise Klein just added, the mirror image at the end seems to represent his clear conscience at the end of the film. Earlier, his reality was warped when he admitted the affair, followed by his distorted reflection at the butcher shop.
Ooh.
That's nice.
That's really nice. Yeah, who said that?
Promise Klein.
Okay, all right. Well,
nice, we're going to quote you, Promise, if we write about this.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I take it back. We'll just steal it. Don't.
Yeah, that's right. I do think that there isn't closure for us with Jim as a character exactly until the daughter understands more her father, and at that point, I think talking about him as the only protagonist doesn't really make sense for this film, because it shifts between him and his daughter, and his daughter becomes the primary character at the end, because it's her having to make peace with her memories of her father, forgive him, and give him this ritual where she has the priest put the two of the rabbit's feet in his hands in the coffin, which I think must represent her forgiveness of her father's flaws. I mean, this is something that we all do, right? We go through this phase of idealizing, well, not all of us, because some people have horrible, horrible parents, so I don't want to speak for everybody, but I have pretty good parents, but you go through that Freudian phase that he calls the family romance, where you first idealize, then you see all their flaws, but then you eventually get to middle age like me, and I think, they were pretty good parents, and I must fuck up, excuse my language, I probably should watch it. I must screw up myself. I don't know. Is this PG?
Film.
That's okay. It's going to go on YouTube, though. They're going to have to bleep me out for YouTube.
Will they? Sorry, Whitney.
Doesn't Veronica say that it was his request that the rabbit's feet be put in the casket with him? So it's something that reflects on her sense of honoring him.
Oh, and it sounds, by the way, that gives us some clue that he didn't die in an accident. in a car crash or something. People don't usually make dying wishes while they're dying, so.
Yeah, if we were to think he committed suicide, there'd be some
Oh, there was
indication.
kind of a letter. Yeah, that's true. But I think he probably died. Well, yeah, that's.
I still think it's honoring him, though, even though it's his dying wish. Like, if I can imagine family relationships where there's so much difficulty and so much anger that the dying wish doesn't matter. I mean, the dying wish would matter to the child. Who was I reading about who cut himself off from his mother and didn't speak to her? And then when she died, he refused to go to her funeral. Somebody famous who talked about that. So I don't know. I still think it's a way of honoring him. I mean, as you said, Adam, he is the guest of honor. And she seems, at the end, Veronica seems more, after she's heard this story, more thoughtful about her father. At least that's the way I read it.
You said the word. This film, by the way, just a quick note. My parents are fine, but my kids have really good parents. Anyway, so, but this movie, more than any other Egoyan film I've seen, is about forgiveness. I don't think he deals with forgiveness that well or often in some of his other films. But I think you're exactly right, because really there are moments where the father forgives the daughter forgives. There's even a kind of strange forgiveness that occurs between Jim, the health inspector, and the Armenian restaurant owners. It's a strange kind of thing, but the guy does go back and he, performs the deed. He chops the feet, and they kind of, there's a sense that they feel sorry for the man, and they realize that he's just a troubled soul who's gone through a lot, and they're grateful that he's gone and that he's left their premises, but he's not. They don't harbor, I think, any resentment towards him or anything along those lines. So I see a lot of forgiveness in this film in ways that you just don't.
He has left them off the hook. He could have closed it down and chooses to believe the fiction that they're having a party on Tuesday. He doesn't probably suspect it's a fiction, but he does forgive them or their sin and shows up. Not to catch them. Actually, the fact that he shows up may be a sign that he was suspicious, or that he thought maybe there wouldn't be a party.
Well, one thing that we didn't discuss, and I know we're coming to the end here, we probably only have a couple minutes, but is this maybe we did to some extent, but the diversity of languages. We did talk about how this movie, everyone in the film comes from somewhere else. Even the priest comes from Texas, right? Has moved up and talks during his eulogy.
He's an immigrant.
Yeah, he talks during his eulogy. He says, when I moved here, I felt alone, and Jim was one of these first, or Veronica's funeral was the first funeral I conducted, and I met Jim at the funeral, and it meant something to me, whatever. So everyone is from somewhere else. Everyone seems to speak a different language. And I don't know, I'm thinking, to stick with the biblical theme, I'm thinking this is kind of an after Babel kind of world that this film inhabits. I don't know, I've never been to Hamilton, but is it, apparently, I guess the second most common language spoken there now is Arabic, but that's probably not that surprising. But it's an incredibly diverse community apparently, and I know that my wife's family, before they moved to the United States, they moved from Guyana to Canada, and that's a kind of a common. Canada is a very welcoming place, unlike the United States, right? A lot of immigrant families put down roots in there, and they seem to manage it. I can't speak. I don't know Canada that well, but they seem to manage better than we do in that sense. Egoyan's films generally deal with that. Keith, last question of the night, I think.
Let's see. Like I said, there was a lot of chatter about the rabbits, but I think we all sort of discussed that.
Keith, can I ask, this is a question for Whitney, will these comments and questions be posted when this goes up onto YouTube? Because I think that the Hang Seng So discussion that we did, I think those do.
Yes.
Those
it should all be there as comments.
So that's great. So people will know that, this will live on YouTube. Many, many more people, I think almost 300 people have watched that Hang Seng So video now. So many more people will read this and they'll see your comments there. So even though we didn't get a chance to address them, they will have some kind of posterity, some kind of afterlife. It's not all for nothing.
Exactly. And you can even Adam, you can visit this comment thread and reply to stuff too.
Yeah, on
later.
YouTube, yeah, actually, I'll invite Jim and Craig to do the same. For you guys.
Let's see. I guess if there's any question that's not like a deep discussion going on, is why was the owner's immediate response to Jim's speech was to pull out his phone and record it? What was he expecting to happen?
Well, I would say that's connected to how we see things through the prism of our media. I mean, often. I mean, I think that's a little bit of a critique of that moment, that rather than, I mean, we're seeing this sort of tragedy unfold, and rather than just experience it, they film it. Maybe he also thinks this could protect him if there's problems. But
they're in a position where they could be shut down if things don't go the way they're hoping. If he discovers this is a fraudulent party, so they want to have a record of whatever he says. They have no idea what he's going to confess to, but that was my assumption.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting in that speech. I was going to quote something just to get it in. He says, Jim says, I realized what I saw was not what it was, talking about the rabbits. So at the moment, the thing he's talking about, what I saw, the illegal action of having, I guess, unskinned rabbits was not what it was. He's wrong about that. And yet the comment itself is so right about so much other things, like about Veronica's, what she saw was not what it was with the hand holding. You know, what she thought was an act of illicit sexual love was really a condolence that Alicia, I think that's the name of the music teacher, was doing. And so much in our lives, what we see is not what it was. We misread things, and that's such an important Egoyan theme. But I like the fact that Egoyan puts it into this film incorrectly. At the point that Jim is pointing at, he's misread this one. That one was what he saw. What it was, and yet he's so right about other things.
Yeah. Some consider what Veronica has done. First of all, she lies to Clive that she has she's already arranged dinner with Mike the bus driver, which is untrue. And then they fake the sexual behavior in their room, which is untrue. And the texts that are sent are not true. There's a lot of fakery and misreading of untruth as truth in what's playing out here. So that becomes a kind of a nice kind of over conclusion about what's been going on, for him to say that at the end.
Yeah, so he's an epistemological, I'm sorry, he's an epistemological filmmaker. He's interested in what we can know for sure and what we don't know. And I think he comes down on the side of empathy in these questions of knowability. You know, listen to the person and maybe, like if somebody comes up to you and says, I need $10, and then I just try to not listen to what else they say, because I want to have empathy, and I give them $1. You know, not $10, but because I'm cheap. But the empathy,
empathy, huh?
Yeah, that's right. That's my empathy. 10%.
10% empathy. Well, I think you'll notice, Keith, that there are no straight answers and short answers from us. So I think we should probably leave it here, guys. We've already kind of overextended our welcome a little bit. But thanks again. Really, a round of applause to Jim and Craig for your contributions. I really appreciate all the work that you guys put into thinking about this film. And really, I know that some of you, you both went back and watched other Egoyan films in preparation for this. And of course, Keith and Whitney, you guys have been really fantastic in helping us organize these, and I really appreciate your support of our program. So, and then of course, finally, I want to thank everybody who stuck around for this conversation. I really appreciate it. Your just stick around for the whole thing. Your patience and everything is greatly appreciated. So thank you all, and have a good night. And check out more Egoyan films, and also check out that virtual cinema at denverfilm.org and D-Phi, the Human Context podcast. Okay, I've got all my plugs in. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
See you guys.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody.
Hooray for D-Phi.
Thanks so much.
And thanks for the center.